I remember the taste of clean water. That seems foolish to confess, now that I'm writing this in the dark with trembling hands that no longer feel entirely my own. But it's true. I remember the metallic tang from the canteen I carried during basic training on the Hive World, where I was born, and I remember thinking even then that it tasted wrong, too sharp, like licking rust. But I would give anything to taste that water again instead of what we drink here. The water on this world tastes like copper and something else. Something sweet and rotten that coats your throat and makes you want to retch even as you swallow it down because the alternative is dying of thirst. We've all learned to drink it. We've all learned to do many things we never imagined we could do. They told us we were shipping out to a combat zone. That's what they always tell you, I suppose. But this time, they used words like extreme operational environment and maximum threat assessment, and other phrases that meant nothing to us then. We were just guardsmen, after all, conscripts from the lower hive levels who'd been deemed fit enough to hold a lasgun and follow orders. My designation was 4477 Kappa 77. Though my mother had called me Davian before the administratum took me. I try not to think about her anymore. I try not to think about any of them, all the people I used to know in that other life that feels like it belonged to someone else entirely. But sometimes, in the moments before sleep comes, if sleep comes, I remember her face, and I have to bite down on my sleeve to keep from making sounds that might alert the others to my weakness. The transport ship was called the Eternal Doctrine, a name I found grimly appropriate, given that we spent what felt like an eternity in its belly. 73 days in the warp, they told us later, though time loses meaning in those voyages. The ship groaned constantly, its metal bones creaking with sounds that almost seemed like voices if you listened long enough. I learned not to listen. We all did. The veteran who bunked above me, a scarred man named Torin who'd survived 3 campaigns already, told me that the trick was to pray constantly, to fill your head with the litanies and catechisms, until there was no room for anything else. So, I prayed. I whispered the words they'd taught us in the scholar, the verses about the Emperor's protection and the righteousness of our cause, and I tried very hard not to wonder whether the Emperor could even hear us out here in the darkness between stars. When we made translation back into real space, the alarms started screaming before we'd even reached our deployment pods. I remember the red lights bathing everything in the color of arterial blood, and I remember the way Sergeant Cale's face looked in that crimson glow, all harsh angles and deep shadows. He was shouting orders, but the alarms were so loud I could barely hear him. We grabbed our gear with hands that shook despite our training, despite all the drills and the discipline they'd beaten into us. I checked my lasgun 3 times, power pack secure, mechanism clean, sight calibrated, because that's what you do when you're scared and trying not to show it. You focus on the small things, the procedures, the rituals that keep you anchored to who you're supposed to be. The drop was rough. They're always rough. But this one felt personal, like the planet itself was trying to swat us out of the sky. The pod shuddered and bucked, and I could hear someone vomiting behind me, the sound wet and miserable beneath the roar of atmospheric entry. I kept my eyes closed and recited the guardsman's prayer, the one about dying well in the Emperor's service, and I thought about my mother again, even though I'd sworn not to. Then we hit ground with an impact that rattled my teeth and made my vision go white for a moment. The ramps dropped with a hydraulic hiss, and we poured out into a world that I understood immediately was wrong. The sky was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't any color sky should be, not the gray of a Hive World's smog, not the blue of the propaganda posters showing loyal guardsmen on verdant agri-worlds. This sky writhed. That's the only word for it. It moved like something living, purple and green and colors I don't have names for, all swirling together in patterns that hurt to look at directly. I learned within the first hour not to stare at the sky for too long. Those who did started screaming, and sometimes they didn't stop. The ground beneath our boots felt soft, almost spongy, even though it looked like bare rock. When you walked, it seemed to yield slightly, as if the planet was covered in a membrane stretched over something hollow beneath. The air smelled wrong, too thick with a sweetness that reminded me of rotting fruit and something else, something chemical and sharp that made my eyes water. We wore our rebreathers for the first week until Command decided the atmosphere was technically breathable, which I suppose it was, in the sense that it didn't kill us immediately. Breathing it just made you wish you were dead. We established our first firebase in the ruins of what might have once been a settlement. The buildings were wrong, their architecture twisted in ways that made no geometric sense, walls meeting at impossible angles and doorways that seemed to shift position when you weren't looking directly at them. The commissar, a woman named Valen with eyes like chips of ice, ordered us to demolish 3 structures that were deemed spiritually compromising. We burned them with promethium and watched as the flames took on colors flames shouldn't have, blue and violet, and a shade of yellow that seemed to glow from within. The smoke rose in spirals that looked almost deliberate, and if you looked at them just right, they seemed to form faces. I stopped looking. That first night, we lost 17 men. They were on perimeter guard when it happened. I was inside the firebase, trying to sleep on a bedroll that smelled of mildew and fear sweat, when I heard the screaming start. It wasn't the kind of screaming you hear in training exercises or even in the vid feeds of battles we'd been shown to prepare us for combat. This was something primal, the sound of a mind breaking apart. By the time we reached the perimeter, there was nothing left but their weapons and their uniforms, neatly arranged as if they'd undressed themselves and walked away naked into the darkness. There was no blood. There was nothing to indicate violence had occurred. They were simply gone, and their lasguns lay on the ground, still warm from their hands. The commissar executed 3 men the next morning for failing to maintain adequate vigilance. We all watched as she shot them in the back of the head, one after another, their bodies crumpling like puppets with cut strings. Then we burned the corpses, because that was protocol on this world. Everything got burned. Everything. We learned that you didn't bury the dead here because the ground didn't keep them. When we tried, in those first few days, the bodies had a tendency to dig themselves back up. The enemy came on the 3rd day. I'd started to think maybe they didn't exist, that we'd been sent to this nightmare world to fight ghosts and madness rather than any tangible foe. But they came, and I learned that ghosts and madness could carry weapons and wear armor, and kill you just as thoroughly as any human soldier. They looked almost human at first glance, these cultists who served the dark powers, but the similarities were superficial. Their faces were too long, their joints bent in directions joints shouldn't bend, and their eyes reflected the wrong light. They wore armor cobbled together from scrap and bone, and they painted themselves with symbols that seemed to move on their skin like living tattoos. The first firefight lasted 7 hours. We held our position in the ruins while they came at us in waves that seemed endless, their throats raw from screaming prayers to gods whose names were forbidden even to think. My lasgun grew hot in my hands, the power pack draining faster than I'd ever seen in any drill. I fired until my shoulder ached from the recoil and my vision blurred from the lasbolt's glare. Men died around me. Torhen took a round through the throat and drowned in his own blood while I crouched beside him, and a boy named Mikhail who'd bunked near me was torn apart by something with too many limbs that moved too fast to see clearly. I shot that thing until it stopped moving, until it was just meat and chitin scattered across the spongy ground, and then I vomited until there was nothing left in my stomach but bile. We won that engagement, if you could call it winning. We held our position. We killed more of them than they killed of us. The commissar commended our steadfast service to the Emperor's glory while we stood at attention among the corpses, and I tried not to look at Tauren's body where it lay cooling in the alien mud. That night, they promoted me to corporal and gave me his bunk. I didn't want it. I didn't want any of it. But you don't refuse promotions in the Imperial Guard, so I took his personal effects, a worn prayer book, and a locket containing a picture of a woman I didn't recognize, and I tried to sleep in his bed while the sky writhed overhead, and things that might have been birds or might have been something else entirely screamed in the darkness beyond our perimeter. The days began to blur together after that. We fought, we died, we burned our dead, and received replacements who arrived in drop pods. looking young and terrified in ways that must have mirrored how I'd looked such a short time ago. I stopped learning their names after a while. It seemed cruel to both of us to form attachments that would only end in grief. Instead, I numbered them in my head: the tall one, the one with the scar, the one who prayed too loudly, and I tried not to think about the fact that someone was probably doing the same with me. The world itself seemed to be fighting us as much as the cultists were. The geography changed. I know how that sounds, how impossible it is, but I swear by the Emperor it's true. We'd map a route to a objective one day, and the next day the terrain would be different. Rivers flowed in different directions. Hills appeared where there had been valleys. Once, we marched for 6 hours toward a target that should have been 10 kilometers away and ended up back at our own firebase, approaching it from the opposite direction we'd left. The tech priests blamed our navigation equipment, then our auspexes, then finally fell silent and made the sign of the Aquila whenever anyone asked for explanations. I started having dreams around the 3rd week, or maybe the 4th. Time had begun to lose meaning by then, the days and nights blending together into an endless cycle of patrol and combat and restless sleep. In the dreams, I was walking through the hive where I'd been born, but everything was subtly wrong. The streets were the same, but the buildings were made of meat instead of rockcrete. My mother was there, calling my name, but when I got close enough to see her face, it wasn't her face at all, just a smooth expanse of skin with her voice coming from somewhere inside. I'd wake up shaking, my blanket soaked with sweat that smelled sweet and wrong, and I'd lie there in the darkness, wondering if I was going insane or if insanity was simply the natural state of being human on this world. Others were having dreams too. We didn't talk about them, not officially, but you could see it in the way men moved in the mornings, sluggish and haunted. The commissar shot a man named Greaves for spiritual corruption after he was caught drawing symbols in the dirt with a stick, strange spiraling patterns that looked almost like the ones we'd seen in the smoke of burning buildings. He swore he didn't know why he was drawing them, that his hand had moved on its own, but that didn't matter. The Emperor's justice is absolute. We watched him die, and then we went back to our duties, because that's all we could do. The cultists attacked in greater numbers as time went on, as if the world was spawning them from its own substance. They came shrieking out of the twisted forests that appeared overnight where there had been bare rock the day before. They emerged from caves that didn't exist on any of our maps. Once, they rose up from the ground itself during a night assault, clawing their way through the spongy soil like the corpses we'd tried to bury in those early days. We killed them with lasgun fire and flamers, and the kind of desperate brutality that comes when you're fighting for your life against an enemy that shouldn't exist. I killed my first cultist up close during a skirmish in the ruins of what the tech priests called a probable former industrial complex. My lasgun had jammed the moisture in the air, played hell with our equipment, and he was on me before I could clear it, his knife raised high, and his face twisted with religious ecstasy. I grabbed my entrenching tool and swung it with all the strength fear gave me. Felt it crunch into the side of his skull with the impact that jarred my arms. He went down, but he was still moving, still reaching for me with fingers that were too long and had too many joints. So I hit him again and again until there was nothing left that could be called a head. His blood was the wrong color, dark purple instead of red, and it burned where it splattered on my skin. I still have the scars. We took prisoners sometimes, when command ordered us to. The interrogators would arrive in their black robes, and we'd hand over the cultists we'd captured and try not to listen to the sounds that came from the interrogation tents. I don't know what they learned from those sessions. I don't think they learned anything useful, because the war never changed. We just kept fighting the same battles over and over in different locations that all looked wrong in similar ways. But the interrogators kept coming, and we kept capturing cultists when we could. And sometimes the cultists would be laughing when we brought them in, laughing like they knew something we didn't, and their laughter would echo in my head for days afterward. The medics started reporting unusual symptoms around the 6th week. Men were developing rashes that looked like words in languages no one could read. Others complained of hearing voices when they were alone, whispered conversations in the static between Vox transmissions. Some reported that their shadows moved independently, that they'd catch glimpses of their own silhouettes doing things they weren't doing. The Medicae did what they could, dispensing blessed unguents and sanctified pharmaceuticals, but the symptoms persisted. We learned to live with them, the way you learn to live with any chronic condition. What choice did we have? I should have known something was deeply wrong when I stopped being afraid. Fear had been my constant companion since we'd arrived on this world. A knot in my stomach that never quite loosened. A tremor in my hands that I'd learned to compensate for when aiming my weapon. But sometime during the second month, or was it the third, the days had become impossible to count. The fear began to fade. Not because things were getting better. If anything, they were getting worse. The cultist attacks were more frequent, more coordinated. We'd lost more than half our original complement, and the replacements kept dying faster than we could train them. No, the fear faded because some part of me had simply given up on survival, had accepted that this world was going to kill me eventually, and there was a strange peace in that acceptance. That should have terrified me. Looking back now, I understand that the loss of fear was itself a symptom, a sign that the world was changing me in ways more fundamental than scars and trauma. But at the time, it felt like relief, like I'd finally become the soldier I was supposed to be, fearless and focused, and ready to die for the Emperor. The Commissar noticed the change in me. She assigned me to lead more patrols, to take point in the most dangerous operations. I accepted these duties without hesitation, without the flutter of panic that would have seized me in those early days. My squad followed me into the ruins and the forests and the caves, and I led them well, and we killed the enemy and completed our objectives, and slowly, so slowly I didn't notice it happening, I stopped thinking of myself as Davian and started thinking of myself only as 4477 Kappa 77. The nightmares changed too. They became less frightening and more vivid, more real than my waking hours. I dreamed of cities that existed in geometries impossible in 3 dimensions, of towers that stretched both up and down simultaneously, of skies that were oceans and oceans that were skies. I dreamed of voices speaking truths that made perfect sense in the moment, but dissolved into gibberish when I tried to remember them upon waking. And I dreamed of home, but home was becoming harder to visualize. My mother's face was a blur now, her voice a memory of a memory. The hive world where I'd spent my first 18 years felt less real than this nightmare planet, with its writhing sky and hungry ground. We received new orders in the 4th month. Or perhaps it was the 5th. Time had become even more unreliable, days stretching or compressing without warning. The sun, or what passed for a sun in this world's toxic sky, rising and setting at intervals that followed no consistent pattern. Command wanted us to push deeper into enemy territory, to establish a foothold in what they called the Blighted Zone, an area where even the cultists seemed reluctant to venture. We were given additional ammunition, extra rations, and a platoon of fresh reinforcements who looked at us veterans with a mixture of awe and horror. I understood why. I'd caught my reflection in a piece of polished metal a few days before, and I barely recognized myself. My face had become gaunt, my eyes hollow, my skin marked with the strange rashes that had become so common among the troops. I looked like a corpse that had forgotten to lie down. The march into the Blighted Zone took 3 days, though my internal sense of time insisted it should have been longer or perhaps shorter. The landscape grew progressively more distorted as we advanced. The trees, if they could be called trees, twisting into spirals and knots, their bark running with sap that glowed faintly in the darkness. The ground became less solid, more liquid, until we were wading through mud that clung to our boots and made sucking sounds with each step. The air grew thicker too, harder to breathe even through our rebreathers, and it tasted of copper and decay and something else, something sweet that made my mouth water and my stomach turn simultaneously. We lost men to the environment before we encountered any cultists. Private Thane stepped off the path we were following and sank up to his waist in ground that had looked solid. We tried to pull him out, but the mud held him fast, and then it started pulling him down. He was screaming, begging us to save him, and we were pulling on his arms with all our strength, but the ground wanted him more than we did. The commissar ordered us to release him before we all got pulled in. We had to obey. We had to watch as he sank slowly beneath the surface, his screams becoming bubbles and then silence. The mud didn't even ripple after he was gone. It just smoothed itself over as if he'd never existed. After that, we moved more carefully, testing each step, staying in single file along whatever solid ground we could find. But the blighted zone claimed more victims. Corporal Vex was taken by something in the trees, snatched up so fast we barely saw what grabbed him. We found his lasgun later, bent into a shape that metal shouldn't be able to take. Another soldier, a replacement whose name I never learned, drank from a stream despite our warnings and died convulsing within minutes, black foam pouring from his mouth and nose. We burned his body where it lay because we couldn't afford to carry it with us. The objective was a structure that our orbital scans had identified as a probable ritual site. When we finally reached it, I understood why the cultists avoided this area. The structure was massive, a twisted cathedral of bone and metal that grew out of the ground like a tumor, its spires reaching up into the writhing sky. It pulsed. I could see it moving, expanding and contracting like something breathing, and when you got close enough you could feel it in your chest, a rhythm that tried to synchronize with your heartbeat, and almost succeeded. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at, that seemed to rearrange themselves when you glanced away and back, and from somewhere deep inside came a sound like singing, voices blending in harmonies that should have been beautiful, but instead filled me with a dread so profound it was almost ecstasy. The commissar ordered us to plant explosives and destroy the structure. We moved in carefully, weapons ready, expecting resistance that never came. The interior was worse than the exterior, vast spaces that seemed larger than the building's outside dimensions could contain, corridors that curved in impossible ways, chambers filled with things I still can't properly describe. We placed the charges according to protocol, working quickly, trying not to look too closely at our surroundings. But I saw things. I saw statues that moved when I wasn't looking at them directly. I saw doorways that opened onto vistas of other worlds or other dimensions, landscapes of color and chaos that made my eyes ache. I saw an altar covered in offerings that might have been flowers or might have been organs, arranged in patterns that seemed to contain meaning just beyond my comprehension. We were on our way out when we found the people. They were in a chamber deep in the structure's heart, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all arranged in concentric circles around a central point that was empty, or perhaps contained something my eyes refused to perceive. They were alive, but not conscious, their eyes open and staring at nothing, their mouths moving in silent prayer, or screams or songs. They wore the remnants of imperial clothing, the uniforms of guardsmen, and the robes of administratum scribes, and the simple garments of civilians. These were imperial citizens, people like us, people who'd been taken by the cultists, or lost to the world, or perhaps simply wandered in here of their own accord, drawn by the singing that never stopped. We should have tried to save them. That's what Imperial Guardsmen do, we protect the Emperor's subjects. But the commissar took one look at them and shook her head. "They're lost," she said, her voice flat and final. "The detonation will be a mercy." And perhaps she was right. Perhaps there was nothing left of who they'd been. Their minds eaten away by whatever this place was, whatever it did. But I still think about them sometimes. Those vacant staring eyes, those silent moving mouths. I think about how they'd been people once, with names and histories and people who'd loved them. I think about how easily any of us could have ended up in their place, arranged in circles around nothing, waiting for an explosion to end existence we were no longer conscious enough to escape. We triggered the explosives from a distance that should have been safe. The structure collapsed in on itself with a sound like the world breaking. Flames and smoke rising in columns that bent at wrong angles and cast shadows that moved against the light. We felt it through the ground, a shockwave that knocked some men off their feet and made the trees around us sway and creak. But the structure didn't die quietly. As it fell, it screamed. I know how that sounds. I know structures can't scream. But this one did. A sound that came not through the air but through the ground itself. A vibration that resonated in my bones and made my teeth ache. And in that scream I heard voices, thousands of them, crying out in pain or ecstasy, or something that was both at once. The march back to our firebase took longer than the march out had, though we were covering the same ground. The blighted zone didn't want to let us go. The paths we'd marked on our way in had vanished or changed, leading us in circles that we only recognized when we passed the same twisted tree for the third time. Corporal Reeves, who'd been with the regiment since the beginning, hung himself from that tree during the night watch. We found him in the morning, swaying gently in a wind that smelled of flowers and rot. His face was peaceful, almost smiling. The commissar ordered us to cut him down and burn his body without ceremony, and we obeyed. But I couldn't stop thinking about that smile, about what he might have seen or understood in his final moments that had brought him peace. By the time we emerged from the blighted zone, we'd lost half the squad. Some to the environment, some to things we encountered in the darkness, some to their own hands. I was now the highest-ranking survivor, which meant the remnants of the platoon looked to me for leadership. I was 23 years old. I felt ancient. My hands shook constantly now, unless I was holding my lasgun, and there was a ringing in my ears that never quite went away, a high-pitched whine like the world was singing at a frequency just beyond normal hearing. The Medicae gave me pills that turned my mouth dry and made colors too bright, and I took them because orders were orders. But they didn't help with the ringing or the shaking or the dreams that had become so vivid they felt more real than waking life. The war continued. Of course it did. Wars don't end just because you want them to, just because you've seen too much and done too much and lost too much. We received new objectives, new orders, new groups of fresh-faced replacements who looked at this nightmare world with the same horror I'd felt in those early days that now seemed like someone else's memories. I trained them as best I could, taught them the lessons I'd learned, written in the blood of all the soldiers who'd died before them. Don't look at the sky too long. Don't drink from the streams. Don't trust the ground to stay solid. Don't trust your dreams. Don't trust anything, really, except your lasgun and your emperor and the man beside you. And even those were uncertain comforts on a world like this. We fought in the ruins and the forests and the open plains, where the grass grew tall and sharp enough to cut through clothing. We fought in the rain that burned skin, and in the snow that fell upward, and in the fog that whispered secrets you didn't want to hear. We killed cultists by the hundreds, by the thousands, and they kept coming, endless waves of corrupted humanity that threw themselves at our positions with a fervor that might have been admirable if it wasn't so horrifying. And sometimes, in the lulls between engagements, I would wonder what we were really accomplishing here. What victory could possibly look like on a world that fought us as much as any enemy, that seemed to exist specifically to drive us mad and break us down into components it could consume. I stopped writing letters home after the 5th month. There didn't seem to be any point. The words I wanted to write about the fear and the horror and the slow erosion of everything I'd once been would never pass the censors, and the approved phrases felt like lies, hollow propaganda that bore no relation to reality. We serve the Emperor with honor. We fight the enemies of mankind with unwavering faith. We will prevail through righteous fury. These were the things I was supposed to say, the sentiments I was supposed to feel, but they rang false in my mouth like coins made of lead. So I stopped writing, and the silence felt more honest than any carefully composed falsehood would have been. My dreams had become something else entirely by then. I no longer dreamed of home, of my mother, of the life I'd had before the Guard. Instead, I dreamed of this world, but a version of it that was somehow more coherent, more purposeful. I dreamed I was walking through cities that made sense according to rules I understood while sleeping but couldn't remember when awake. I dreamed I could read the symbols that covered every surface, that they contained knowledge both terrible and beautiful. I dreamed I heard the singing from the cathedral we'd destroyed, and in my dreams I understood the words and they were glorious. I woke from these dreams with tears on my face and a longing in my chest for something I couldn't name, and I knew with a certainty that terrified me that the world was changing me, that it had been changing me since the moment I'd set foot on its surface, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The others were changing too. I could see it in their eyes, in the way they moved, in the things they didn't say. We were all becoming something other than what we'd been. Something shaped by prolonged exposure to this reality that shouldn't exist. The veteran soldiers, those few who'd survived from the original deployment, had started to look less human and more like the cultists we fought. Not in any obvious way that would trigger an execution, but in subtle things. The way their joints bent, just slightly wrong. The way their shadows seemed to move independently. The way they could predict where the cultists would attack next, not through training or tactical analysis, but through some instinct that shouldn't exist. I realized I was doing it too. I was anticipating enemy movements with accuracy that disturbed me. I was navigating the changing terrain with a certainty that defied logic. I was understanding the symbols we saw everywhere, not consciously, but in a way that made me choose certain paths over others, certain actions over alternatives, and those choices always seemed to work out, even when they made no tactical sense. I was becoming something native to this world, and the worst part was how natural it felt, how right, like I was finally finding my place in an order that had always been waiting for me. The commissar noticed. Of course she did. That was her job. To watch for corruption, for the subtle signs of spiritual compromise. She started keeping me close, assigning me to duties where she could observe me directly, and I knew I was being evaluated for termination. I should have been terrified. I should have been desperately trying to prove my loyalty, to demonstrate that I was still a faithful servant of the Emperor. But I felt nothing except a strange calm, an acceptance that whatever was going to happen would happen regardless of my fear or resistance. We were on a patrol, just the commissar and me and 3 other soldiers, when we encountered it. Not cultists this time, but something else, something that stepped out of the air itself, like it had been waiting there all along, just slightly out of phase with reality. It was beautiful and terrible, its form shifting between states that my eyes couldn't quite reconcile, sometimes humanoid, sometimes something else entirely, always wrong in ways that made my brain hurt trying to process it. The other soldiers opened fire immediately, their lasguns spitting coherent light that passed through the thing without effect, or perhaps hit it in dimensions we couldn't perceive. The commissar was shouting orders, her bolt pistol roaring, but I just stood there watching it. I knew I should be afraid, should be fighting, should be doing something other than staring at this impossible entity that should not and could not exist. But I felt something else instead. Recognition. It looked at me, it had eyes, or something like eyes, or perhaps it was looking at me with senses that had nothing to do with vision, and in that gaze, I felt seen in a way I'd never experienced before. It knew me. It knew what I was becoming. And in that moment of contact, something inside me shifted, like a puzzle piece falling into place, like a lock clicking open, like coming home after a long absence to find everything exactly where you'd left it. Then the commissar shot me. The bolt round hit me in the shoulder, the explosive shell detonating on impact and tearing away flesh and bone and leaving me on the ground bleeding and screaming. Through the haze of pain I saw her shoot the other soldiers too, efficient executions to the back of the head, their bodies crumpling like empty sacks. Then she was standing over me, her pistol aimed at my face, and I could see the cold calculation in her eyes as she decided whether I was worth saving or should be purified along with the others. "Tell me you still serve the Emperor," she said, her voice cutting through my screams. "Tell me you haven't been compromised. Tell me you're still human." I wanted to tell her what she needed to hear. I wanted to lie convincingly enough that she'd lower her weapon and call for a medicae, and I might survive this. But when I opened my mouth, what came out was laughter, high and wild, and not entirely my own. Because the truth I'd been trying not to acknowledge for months, was that I didn't know anymore. I didn't know if I was still human, or what being human even meant on a world like this. I didn't know if I served the Emperor, or if I'd ever really understood what that service entailed. I didn't know anything except that my shoulder was on fire and I was probably going to die, and somehow that seemed almost funny in a horrible way that made the laughter keep bubbling up from my chest. She didn't kill me. I still don't understand why. Perhaps she saw something in my laughter that convinced her I was still salvageable. Perhaps she simply didn't want to waste the ammunition. Perhaps some part of her, underneath the commissariat training and the absolute certainty, was as confused and compromised as I was. She called for extraction, and they took me back to the firebase, and the Medicae patched me up as best they could with the supplies they had and the knowledge that applied to normal wounds in normal places. My arm would never work quite right again. The explosive round had done too much damage to the nerves and muscles and bone. But I was alive, and in the Imperial Guard. That was victory enough. They gave me a medal. I don't remember what it was called, or what it was, for something about courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Some formulaic citation that could have applied to any of 1,000 actions on this damned world. They pinned it to my uniform, and I stood at attention while the regimental commander said words about duty and sacrifice, and I tried to feel proud or honored or something appropriate to the occasion. But all I felt was tired, so deeply tired that no amount of sleep would ever be enough, and a strange distant curiosity about what I was becoming and whether the transformation would be complete before this war finally killed me. The war didn't kill me, though. Not directly. I survived engagement after engagement, mission after mission, leading my squads through horrors that should have broken us all. I survived when better soldiers died, when more faithful men were taken by the world or the enemy or their own minds. I survived, and I kept changing, kept adapting, kept becoming something that could exist on this nightmare planet without going completely mad. And that, I think, was my real corruption. Not that I'd turned traitor or embraced the dark powers, but that I'd learned to be comfortable in hell. I can see it now in the others who've been here as long as I have. We move differently than the new replacements. We speak differently, using words and phrases that aren't quite high Gothic, that contain meanings the fresh troops don't understand. We understand the world in ways they don't, can navigate its impossibilities, can anticipate its betrayals. We've been here so long that the world has rewritten us in its own image, made us native to its alien logic. We are still Imperial Guardsmen. We still fight the Emperor's enemies. We still follow orders and maintain discipline and die when required. But we are also something else now, something that has no name in the official lexicon, something that exists in the space between human and other. The nightmares never stopped, but they changed character again. Now I dream that I'm back on my hive world, walking through the familiar streets, and everyone I meet is wrong in subtle ways that no one else seems to notice. My mother's eyes are the wrong color. The shopkeeper I used to buy from has too many fingers. The preachers in the chapel are reciting liturgies that sound right but contain words I know aren't in the standard texts. And in these dreams, I'm the only one who can see the wrongness, the only one who understands that we're all living in a lie so complete that truth has become indistinguishable from madness. I wake from these dreams uncertain which reality is the false one, the nightmare world where I fight and survive, or the memory of home that grows more distant and distorted with each passing day. They extended our deployment indefinitely. No rotation off-world, no reinforcement by fresh regiments, just the gradual replacement of casualties with new recruits who'd be shaped by this world the way we had been. We were here forever, or until we died, which amounted to the same thing. The realization should have broken morale, should have led to despair or desertion or mass psychological collapse. But it didn't. We accepted it the way we'd accepted everything else, with a numbness that might have been resilience, or might have been the final stage of spiritual death. We would fight here until we died. We would kill the cultists and burn the structures and patrol the shifting terrain until the world or the enemy or our own transformed bodies gave out. And when we died, we'd be replaced by others who'd undergo the same slow corruption, the same gradual rewriting of self, until they too became whatever we had become. I'm writing this in the dark because the lights in our barracks don't work right anymore. They flicker and pulse in rhythms that shouldn't exist, that seemed to echo the heartbeat I felt in the cathedral we destroyed months or maybe years ago. My remaining arm shakes as I write, the tremor that never went away. And the words come out wrong sometimes, symbols mixed in with letters, meanings that exist in dimensions beyond simple language. When I read back what I've written, parts of it don't make sense, or make too much sense, or contain knowledge I don't remember learning. But I keep writing because I need to document this, need to leave some record of what happens when you send human beings to fight on a world that exists to unmake them. The commissar died 3 weeks ago, or perhaps it was 3 days, or 3 months. Time doesn't work right here anymore, and I've given up trying to track it in any meaningful way. She died leading an assault on a cultist stronghold, shot through the head by a sniper we never found. They buried her with full honors, her body wrapped in blessed shrouds and lowered into ground we all knew wouldn't keep her. I attended the ceremony and I felt nothing. Not grief, not relief, not even satisfaction at the death of the woman who'd shot me and killed my squad. Just that same vast emptiness that had become my constant companion, broken only by moments of terrible clarity when I understood exactly what I'd become and was powerless to change it. I dream sometimes that I'm back in the cathedral before we destroyed it, standing in that central chamber looking at the people arranged in their circles. But now I'm one of them, my eyes open and staring, my mouth moving in silent liturgy to powers I still can't name. And the others in the circle are all the soldiers I've known, all the men and women who've died on this world or been changed by it. We're all there together, united in our transformation, our service to the Emperor transmuted into something else entirely. And from the center of our circle, where nothing should exist, comes a light that is also darkness, a presence that is also absence, and in its regard, I feel complete for the first time since I left my home world all those lives ago. I wake from these dreams and go on patrol, leading my squad through terrain that shifts and changes, fighting enemies that are becoming increasingly hard to distinguish from allies. We kill and we survive and we change, and I no longer know if we're winning or losing or if those categories even apply anymore. All I know is that I'm still here, still breathing the poisoned air and drinking the tainted water, and following orders that come down from commanders I've never met on worlds I can barely remember. I'm still 4477 Kappa 77, a soldier of the Imperium, faithful unto death. But I don't know who Davian was anymore. That name, that person, belongs to a reality I can no longer access, a past that might as well be fiction. When I try to remember my mother's face, I see instead the twisted statues from the cathedral. When I try to remember the taste of clean water, I taste only copper and rot. When I try to remember what it felt like to be human, all I find is this emptiness, this acceptance, this slow dissolution into something that wears a human shape but contains depths that are anything but. The sky is writhing overhead as I write this, purple and green and colors that hurt to name. The ground beneath my bunk feels soft, yielding, like it's slowly digesting us all. And from somewhere in the distance comes singing, that eternal singing that never quite stops, that calls to something inside me I'm terrified to acknowledge. I should report this. I should tell someone that I hear the voices, that I understand them, that they're making sense in ways that should be impossible. I should confess my corruption and accept purification and die clean rather than live compromised. But I won't. I'll keep this journal hidden and I'll keep serving and I'll keep changing, because that's what this world demands, and I'm too tired to resist anymore. I'll fight the cultists who are perhaps less corrupted than I am. I'll follow orders that may or may not come from Imperial Command. I'll lead my squads into battles we might not survive, and if we do survive, we'll be a little less human than before, and a little more something else. This is what it's like to be a guardsman fighting on a Daemon World. Not the glorious last stands they show in the propaganda, not the heroic sacrifice, the noble death in the Emperor's service. Just the slow erosion of everything you were, the gradual transformation into something that can survive here by ceasing to be entirely yourself. Just the endless grinding routine of fighting and dying and changing until you can't remember what you were supposed to be protecting or why it mattered or whether the Emperor's light can even reach this far into darkness. I'll keep writing as long as I can, as long as my hand can hold a stylus, and my mind can form words that approximate human thought. And maybe someday someone will find this journal, will read these pages and understand what really happens to soldiers sent to fight on worlds that exist beyond the boundaries of sane reality. Maybe they'll understand that we don't lose this war through lack of courage or faith or firepower. We lose it because the world itself is the enemy, and it fights by remaking us in its image, by turning us into the very thing we came here to destroy. Or maybe no one will ever read this. Maybe I'll die in the next engagement, and this journal will be lost or burned with my body. Maybe it will sink into the hungry ground along with everything else this world consumes. Maybe the words themselves will transform into the symbols that cover every surface, becoming part of the world's own terrible scripture. It doesn't matter. I had to write it anyway, had to leave some mark. Some testament to the fact that I was human once, that I served faithfully, that I tried to hold on to who I was, even as this place pulled me apart and reassembled the pieces into something new. I had to document the truth. They won't tell you in the recruitment speeches or the victory reports that there are battlefields where the enemy isn't the ones shooting at you, but the ground beneath your feet and the air you breathe and the dreams that rewrite you night by night until you wake up wearing your old face like a mask over features that have become fundamentally other. The singing is getting louder now. I can hear it through the walls, through the ground, through my own bones. It's calling me, calling all of us, and I know that one day, maybe tomorrow, maybe years from now, in whatever way time flows on this world, I'll answer it. We all will. Every soldier who stays here long enough will eventually hear it and understand it and walk into whatever awaits at its source. Not because we are corrupted or weak or faithless, but because this is what the world does. This is its purpose, its function, its victory condition. It transforms us, it remakes us, it consumes us and births us anew as something that belongs to it rather than to the Emperor or the Imperium or ourselves. And the terrible thing, the thing I can barely admit, even to this journal that no one may ever read, is that part of me wants it. Part of me is tired of resisting, tired of maintaining the fiction of humanity, tired of pretending I'm still the person who stepped off that dropship all those months or years or lifetimes ago. Part of me wants to give in, to surrender, to let the transformation complete itself and find out what exists on the other side of this slow dissolution. But not yet. Not today. Today I'll clean my lasgun and check my ammunition and lead my squad on patrol through terrain that makes no sense. Today I'll fight the cultists and burn the bodies and try not to notice that they look more human than we do. Today I'll serve the Emperor as best I can with whatever's left of who I was and who I'm becoming. Tomorrow, perhaps, I'll make it one more day. Or perhaps I won't. Perhaps tomorrow the singing will become too loud to ignore, or my body will finish its transformation into something that can't wear an Imperial uniform, or some cultist's bullet will find me and end this slow torture of incremental change. Either way, I'll face it as what I am, a soldier of the Imperium, faithful unto death, serving on a world that exists to teach us that faith and service and duty are just other forms of surrender, that in the end we all become what we fight against, and that the Emperor's light, if it exists at all, cannot reach into every corner of the galaxy's darkness. The sky writhes overhead, the ground hungers beneath, the singing never stops, and I am still here, still human enough to write these words, still corrupted enough to understand them in ways that should be impossible. This is my testimony. This is my confession. This is what it's like to be a guardsman fighting on a demon world, and I pray to whatever might be listening that you never have to learn firsthand what these words really mean. In the Emperor's name, though I can no longer remember what that name once meant to me, I remain faithful, or corrupted, or both at once, because on this world, perhaps they're the same thing. 4477 Kappa 77. Signing off from hell. May the Emperor protect you. Because he certainly couldn't protect us.